Hello hockey fans, Oddman Rush here and welcome back to another video. On April 9th, 2016, the Detroit Red Wings earned a trip to the 2016 Stanley Cup playoffs, thanks to the Boston Bruins suffering a 6-1 beatdown from the Ottawa Senators. Now, while plenty of teams reach the playoffs every year, the Red Wings spot meant far more than most, as by punching their ticket to the dance, Detroit had clinched a postseason berth in each of the last 25 seasons, meaning they had made it to the playoffs every single year since 1991. Though they had reached the postseason every year for the last 2.5 decades, it may surprise you to learn that Detroit's run isn't the longest playoff streak in NHL history. In fact, the Red Wings' feat is tied for third place in the league's record books, with several teams having matched or even surpassed this streak in the many years both before and since. So who holds the record? Which team has made the most consecutive appearances in the Stanley Cup playoffs? Well, let's crack open the history books and find out, shall we? So in today's video, join me as we explore the longest playoff streak in NHL history. Now, in order to tell this record-breaking tale, allow me to take you back to the 1967-68 NHL season. The league was entering its 51st year of play, the Toronto Maple Leafs were the defending Cup champions, and the number of teams had just increased from 6 to 12 thanks to the 1967 expansion. With the NHL doubling overnight, the league's original 6 franchises were eager to assert their dominance and put their newfound contemporaries firmly in their place. One of these teams was the Boston Bruins, who had built an impressive young roster that was ready to take their game to the next level, thanks in large part to high-scoring forwards Phil Esposito and Johnny Bucyk, star goaltender Gerry Cheevers, as well as 19-year-old defenseman and future league legend Bobby Orr. Despite failing to reach the playoffs in each of the last 8 years, Boston's luck would finally change during the 67-68 season, as their 37-27-10 record would earn them third place in the East Division and their first playoff appearance since 1959. Unfortunately though, their postseason run would be short-lived, as they were swept in the opening round by the eventual Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens. At least they lost to the best, right guys? Though they would bow out in the first round, and though they failed to get their hands on a championship, this playoff run would earn its place in the history books, as it kicked off the longest postseason streak the league has ever seen. The next 4 seasons would see the Bruins kick things up a notch and morph into legitimate championship contenders in the process. Thanks to continued excellence from Esposito, Bucyk, and fellow forward Ken Hodge, amongst several others of course, solid goaltending from netminders Gerry Cheevers and Eddie Johnston, as well as revolutionary play from perennial Norris winner Bobby Orr, Boston registered a 193, 62, and 53 record in 308 regular season games. They recorded 99 points or more every single year, and they finished with more points than any other NHL team on 2 separate occasions while they were at it too. If all of that wasn't impressive enough though, the Bruins would also get their hands on several championships during this time. Though they would bow out in the second round in 1969, and though they suffered a first round exit in 1971, Boston would lift the Stanley Cup both in 1970 and again in 1972, thanks to their sweep of the St. Louis Blues and their Game 6 win over the New York Rangers respectively. So after missing the playoffs for 8 years straight, and after recently suffering several early exits, Boston had just won 2 Stanley Cups in 3 years. Though they would fail to clinch another championship during their record-breaking run, and though it took them nearly 4 decades to finally hoist the trophy again, the Bruins' playoff streak was only just getting started. The rest of the 1970s saw Boston keep up the good work and remain one of the best teams across the entire NHL for the rest of the decade. Thanks to the continued excellence from Esposito, Orr and Hodge during the early to mid-70s, consistent production from Busick for much of the decade, as well as strong performances from acquisition Jean Rattel and Brad Park during the late 70s, the Bruins would post a 380, 165 and 91 record in 636 games over the next 8 years. Thanks to these incredible numbers, Boston would finish first in their division 5 times during this span, they would finish top of the league standings once, they would reach 50 wins 3 times, and they would record 100 points or more on 7 separate occasions. So yeah, the Boston Bruins were a pretty great team during the 1970s. As you might expect, these performances would help Boston punch their ticket to the playoffs every single year, bringing their postseason streak to an impressive 13 years from 1968 to 1980. Though they would fail to get their hands on another championship during each of these attempts, the Bruins would produce plenty of deep playoff runs during this span, as they made it to the semi-final round 5 times in 8 years between 1973 and 1980, and they made 3 appearances in the Stanley Cup Finals too, only to fall at the final hurdle every single time. Ooh, so close yet so far. As the 70s ended and the 1980s began, Boston would continue to find success during the new decade, but some years would be far better than others. With the high-scoring play of Rick Middleton, Barry Pedersen and Peter McNabb, the emergence of the team's new star defenseman Raymond Bourque, as well as reliable goaltending from Marco Barron, Rogie Vachon and Pete Peters, the Bruins would pick up right where they left off during the first half of the 80s, posting a 179, 102 and 39 record in 320 games between the 80-81 season and the 83-84 season, finishing top of their division twice and registering 100 points or more twice in the process. However, the mid-1980s saw the Bruins struggle far more than usual and almost saw their playoff streak come to an end. Despite Bourque, Middleton and Ken Linseman providing much of the offensive firepower, and despite a breakout performance from the team's recent trade acquisition Cam Neely, Boston would win just 107 of their 240 games between the 84-85 season and the 86-87 season. In fact, the Bruins struggled so much that they finished only 3rd or 4th place in the Adams division in each of these 3 seasons, the first time they had dropped below 2nd place since the year before their playoff streak began, all the way back in 1967. While it came narrowly close to ending, Boston's postseason streak would continue by the skin of its teeth, though they would bow out in the first round in each of these 3 seasons, and they would be swept on 2 separate occasions during this span. Not exactly a cup-winning performance, but Boston had continued to make it to the dance and they had somehow kept their streak alive, so it certainly could have gone worse all things considered. Following a turbulent middle of the decade, the late 1980s would see the Bruins return to form and get back to their winning ways. After all, due to the high-scoring play of Bourque, Neely and Linseman, a breakout performance from young gun Craig Janney, as well as reliable goaltending from netminders Reggie Lemelin and Andy Moog, Boston would post a 127, 84 and 35 record in 240 games during the final 3 seasons of the decade. They would finish 2nd or higher in the Adams division every year, and they even topped the league standings during the 89-90 season too. Looks like they were back to their old selves again, right guys? So we know that Boston reached the playoffs every year during the 80s, but how did they perform during these postseason runs? Well, in the 10 years between the 80-81 season and the 89-90 season, Boston would reach the second round of the postseason 5 times, they would reach the conference finals 3 times, and they would make it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals on 2 separate occasions, where they were eventually bested by the Dynasty Edmonton Oilers, both in 1988 and 1990. It's tough to lift the trophy when 2 teams were hogging the cup for most of the decade, folks? Despite failing to get their hands on another championship, and despite falling at the final hurdle on numerous occasions, Boston would earn a pretty special place in the league's record books during this time. By securing their spot in the 1989 Stanley Cup playoffs, Boston set a new league record for the most consecutive playoff appearances with 22, surpassing the previous record of 21 set by the Montreal Canadiens between 1949 and 1969. So thanks to their consistent play over the last few decades, and thanks to them reaching the playoffs year in, year out, Boston had clinched a postseason berth every year for over 2 decades, and they had set a new league record in the process. Though they had carved their name into league history, and though they sat alone atop the record books, Boston's postseason streak would continue for quite some time. With the league entering the 1990s, and with Boston having made the playoffs every year since 1968, the Bruins were eager to keep their streak going and remain a premier team in the National Hockey League. Thanks to the Norris-caliber play of Raymond Bourque, productive performances by Craig Janney and recent trade acquisition Adam Oates, as well as dependable netminding from the team's now legitimate starting goalie Andy Moog, Boston would do exactly that during the early years of the decade, as they won 151 of their 248 games between the 1991 and 92-93 seasons. They reached 100 points twice during this span, and they registered 50 wins once while they were at it as well. Unfortunately though, these strong performances wouldn't result in any championships, as while Boston would reach the playoffs during each of these 3 years, they would make it out of the first round twice, where they would eventually fall in the conference finals both times. In their defense though, Boston were eliminated by Mario Lemieux and his stacked Pittsburgh Penguins roster, who would go on to win back-to-back championships after their consecutive wins over Boston. So you can understand why the Bruins fell in the penultimate round both times, can't you? Having remained a top team during the regular season, and having produced several deep postseason runs to start the decade, the Bruins would keep up the good work for a little while longer, and continue their impressive form during the mid-1990s. After all, with the continued excellence of Bourque, Oates and Neely, as well as impressive netminding performances from goalies John Casey, Blaine Lachère and Bill Ranford, Boston registered a 109, 78 and 27 record in 214 games during these 3 seasons, and they finished second in the Northeast Division twice in the process. While this play would be good enough to help them reach the playoffs in all 3 years, Boston would struggle to replicate their postseason performances from earlier in the decade, as they made it out of the first round just once during this span, and they lost in the second round the only time that they did. Not exactly a conference finals run, but every loss is equal come playoff time, right guys? Though they had struggled to make it out of the first round for several years now, Boston had remained a consistent playoff contender, and they had reached the postseason every year since 1968. However, their record-breaking streak was about to come to an end. The 1996-97 NHL season saw the Bruins take to the ice for their 73rd year of play and look to return to their deep playoff runs of seasons past. Unfortunately though, things would take a turn for the worse, and then some. Thanks to the mid-season departures of Adam Oates and Rick Tocchet, limited production from all but a handful of players on the roster, such as Bourque, Ted Donato and Josef Stumpel, as well as terrible goaltending from a trio of netminders, Boston finished the season with an abysmal 26, 47 and 9 record in 82 games. The worst record across the entire NHL that year. However, the season's biggest disappointment came on April 8, 1997, when following a 3-1 loss to the Pittsburgh Penguins, it was revealed that Boston had been mathematically eliminated from the playoff race, thus bringing both their postseason hopes and their historic streak to an end. So thanks to their unceremonious exit from postseason contention, the Boston Bruins' record-breaking playoff streak had finally concluded, setting the new league record at a whopping 29 consecutive seasons between 1968 and 1996. The Bruins had clinched a playoff spot every single year for nearly 3 whole decades. Early exits or not, that's one hell of an achievement. To really put this run into perspective though, the Boston Bruins posted a whopping 1,268, 699 and 309 record in 2,276 regular season games during this span, finishing first in their division on 12 separate occasions, leading the entire NHL standings 4 times, and registering 100 points or more in 15 of these 29 seasons. You can see why their streak went on for so long, can't you? Now, while they clearly dominated the regular season for close to 3 decades of play, Boston also found plenty of success during the playoffs too. After all, not only would they register a 152 and 144 record in 296 total playoff games, the Bruins would reach either the semi-final or the conference final round on 13 occasions. They made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals 7 times, and they would lift a pair of championships during this record-breaking run. Now sure, winning 2 cups in 29 straight playoff appearances isn't the greatest conversion rate, but the Bruins went on plenty of deep postseason runs during this streak, and they came just a few wins away from the trophy over half a dozen times too. They weren't an easy opponent to face, that's for sure. Interestingly though, Boston wasn't the only team that embarked on a lengthy playoff streak during this time, as the Chicago Blackhawks began a historic run of their own during the 1969-70 season, just a few years after the Bruins streak started. Though Chicago's streak would also last well over 2 decades, and though they came narrowly close to matching Boston's record, the Blackhawks' run was eventually snapped at 28 consecutive seasons, following their final postseason berth during the 1997 Stanley Cup playoffs. Given that both teams reached the postseason for nearly 30 years straight, and given that each streak began and ended just a few seasons apart, Boston had done well to hold on to their milestone. I mean, the Bruins had set the record just a few years prior, and they watched their competition fall short of their total by just a single playoff run. If that doesn't emphasize just how impressive Boston's record is, I don't know what will. So thanks to their consistent play year after year, and thanks to their various superstars throughout this tenure, the Boston Bruins produced the greatest postseason streak the league has ever seen. After all, the Bruins won over 1,200 regular season games between 1967 and 1997. They continued this dominance through several generations of Bruins rosters, and they somehow made the playoffs every single year for nearly 3 decades straight. Add to that their various deep playoff runs, their numerous trips to the finals, and their pair of Stanley Cup championships, and the Bruins secured one of the toughest records that the league has to offer. They weren't always the best team in the league, and they faced several close calls along the way, but you don't reach the playoffs in 29 consecutive seasons if you're a bad hockey team now, do you? Not bad, Boston. Not bad at all. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was the story of the Boston Bruins and the longest playoff streak in NHL history. What do you guys think about this incredible achievement? Are you surprised that Boston's streak lasted for so long, or did you have zero idea that the Bruins set this record? I certainly had no idea before researching this video, that's for sure. Do let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys have to say, but thank you so much for watching guys, I really do hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.
A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.